Marcus Williams pushed his cleaning cart through the glass corridors of TechVantage headquarters at 2 a.m., the only time the executive floor was empty enough for him to work without being in anyone's way. The San Francisco skyline glittered through floor-to-ceiling windows, thousands of lights representing thousands of people pursuing their versions of success. Marcus had pursued his own version once, a PhD in computer science from Stanford, a promising career at a major tech firm, a future that seemed limitless until his wife's cancer diagnosis consumed everything, their savings, their insurance coverage, their carefully constructed life. Now he was 43 years old, working the graveyard shift as a janitor in the same industry where he'd once been considered brilliant. The irony wasn't lost on him. He cleaned the offices of people half his age making 10 times his salary, emptying trash cans filled with printed code he could debug in his sleep, wiping whiteboards covered with algorithms he'd taught himself 15 years ago. But this job paid weekly, offered health insurance after 90 days, and didn't require explaining the 7-year gap in his resume when he'd been caring for his dying wife and then grieving her loss. Tonight, the executive conference room needed attention. TechVantage's CEO, Victoria Chen, had spent the day there with her senior engineering team, and Marcus could see evidence of their frustration everywhere. Coffee cups abandoned half full, whiteboards covered with crossed-out equations, printed papers crumpled and discarded. He began emptying wastebaskets, and one paper caught his eye. It was dense with mathematical notation, clearly part of some complex problem the team was struggling. Marcus told himself not to look closely. This wasn't his world anymore. He was the janitor, invisible, paid to clean, not to think. But his eyes tracked across the equations anyway, and he immediately spotted the error, a fundamental miscalculation in the third line that was throwing everything else off. It was the kind of mistake that happened when brilliant people worked too long without sleep, when pressure made them miss obvious solutions. He'd made similar errors himself once, back when he had the luxury of making mistakes that mattered. If you've ever been dismissed because of your circumstances rather than your capabilities, stay with us. What happens next will show you why judging people by their position instead of their potential is the most expensive mistake anyone can make. Marcus was straightening the conference table when voices echoed from the hallway. Victoria Chen entered with 3 members of her engineering team, all looking exhausted and frustrated. They didn't acknowledge Marcus's presence. People rarely did. He was part of the furniture, the invisible infrastructure that kept their world running smoothly, while remaining beneath their notice. Marcus moved toward the door to give them privacy, but Victoria's voice stopped him, not intentionally directed at him, but loud enough to hear. We're running out of time. If we can't solve this quantum encryption problem, we lose the $800 million Pentagon contract. $800 million, and my entire team is telling me it's impossible. Her voice carried that particular edge of desperation that Marcus recognized, the sound of someone watching their empire crumble despite doing everything right. One of her engineers, a young man with MIT credentials visible on his lanyard, spread new papers across the table. The mathematics just don't work, Victoria. We've been at this for 6 weeks. Maybe the problem is actually unsolvable. Victoria slammed her hand on the table. Unsolvable is not an option. This contract represents 40% of our projected revenue for the next 3 years. If we lose it, we're looking at massive layoffs, possible bankruptcy, the end of everything we've built. Her eyes swept the room and landed briefly on Marcus, still standing near the door. Her expression shifted to irritation. Excuse me, we need privacy for this meeting. Unless you're suddenly a quantum computing expert, we don't need cleaning right. The dismissal was casual, not deliberately cruel. Just the automatic assumption that a janitor at 2 a.m. had nothing relevant to contribute to a conversation about advanced mathematics. Marcus nodded, said, "Yes, ma'am," the way invisible people were supposed to, and pushed his cart toward the door. But as he passed the whiteboard, his eyes caught the equations again, and before his better judgment could stop him, words fell from his mouth. "You're using the wrong approach for the entanglement calculus." The room went silent. 4 pairs of eyes turned to stare at him with expressions ranging from confusion to outrage. Marcus felt his heart rate spike, the familiar anxiety of having spoken when silence was safer. He should leave now, apologize, return to his invisibility. But Victoria was walking toward him, her face a mixture of disbelief and something that might have been amusement. "Excuse me?" Her tone was sharp. "Did the janitor just tell my engineering team they're wrong?" The MIT engineer laughed, actually laughed, the kind of nervous sound people make when something absurd breaks tension. "This is perfect. We're so desperate we're getting cleaning tips from the maintenance staff." But Marcus was looking at the whiteboard, at the problem he'd been trained to solve, at mathematics that spoke to him in a language more fluent than words. "I apologize, ma'am. I shouldn't have spoken." He turned to leave, but Victoria held up a hand. "No, wait, I'm curious. You said we're using the wrong approach. What approach should we be using?" Her tone was mocking now, the kind of intellectual cruelty that happens when smart people are frustrated, and someone they consider inferior dares to offer input. Please, enlighten us. Share your vast expertise in quantum encryption. Marcus knew he should stay silent. Every instinct screamed to push his cart out the door, to protect his job, to remember his place. But he was tired of being invisible, tired of watching people struggle with problems he could solve, tired of pretending he was less than he was just to make others comfortable. You're approaching it as a linear progression problem, he said quietly. But quantum entanglement doesn't function linearly. You need to model it as a multidimensional state. Collapse. Victoria's expression shifted from mocking to genuinely curious. Multi-dimensional state collapse. And you know this how? Did you take an online course while emptying our trash? The engineers were watching now, their exhaustion temporarily forgotten in the bizarre spectacle of their janitor discussing advanced theoretical physics. Marcus met Victoria's eyes, making a decision that would either cost him his job or change it. I have a PhD in computer science from Stanford, specializing in quantum computing applications. I worked at Bell Labs for 5 years before personal circumstances required me to step away from the field. He said it matter-of-factly, without shame or apology, stating facts that happened to be true. The room's atmosphere changed instantly. The MIT engineer pulled out his phone, clearly searching Marcus's name. Victoria's face shifted through several emotions: surprise, skepticism, a flash of something that might have been embarrassment. Then, why are you working as a janitor? It was the question everyone always asked, as if the only acceptable reason for economic downfall was moral failure, rather than the brutal mathematics of medical bankruptcy and grief. Marcus could have explained about his wife's stage 4 cancer, about the hundreds of thousands in medical bills that insurance refused to cover, about choosing to care for her himself during her final months, rather than letting strangers handle her dying. He could have described the depression that followed, the years it took to function again, the gap in his resume that made him unhireable in the industry that once wanted him. Instead, he said simply, "Life happened, but the mathematics don't care about my employment history. Your approach is still wrong." Victoria stared at him for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised them both. "Fine, show us. If you're so confident we're doing it wrong, prove it." She handed him a marker, gestured toward the whiteboard. "Solve it, right now. Show us this multidimensional state collapse approach." Marcus took the marker, his hand steady despite his racing heart. He hadn't done this in 7 years, hadn't stood before a whiteboard explaining complex mathematics to skeptical audiences. But the knowledge was still there, preserved perfectly in his mind like information stored in quantum states, waiting to collapse into usefulness. He began writing, his marker moving quickly, filling the board with equations that flowed from years of study and practice and natural aptitude that circumstances couldn't erase. The room fell silent, except for the marker's squeak against the whiteboard. Marcus worked for 20 minutes, aware of eyes tracking his every move, aware that this moment would determine whether he remained invisible or became something else entirely. When he finished, he stepped back, his equation complete. The key is treating each quantum state as simultaneously existing until measurement forces collapse. Your team was forcing collapse too early in the sequence, which breaks the entanglement. If you allow the superposition to persist through the entire encryption cycle, the security becomes mathematically unbreakable. The MIT engineer was staring at his phone, then at Marcus, then back at his phone. Dr. Marcus Williams published 17 papers on quantum computing between 2008 and 2015, co-author on the foundational paper for quantum key distribution protocol. Jesus Christ, you're the Marcus Williams. You were a legend at Stanford. He looked at Victoria. Everything he just wrote is correct. It's actually brilliant. This solves the entire problem. Victoria stood very still, her face unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "Dr. Williams, how long have you been working here as a janitor?" Marcus met her eyes. 11 months. Victoria winced visibly. 11 months. You've been cleaning our offices for 11 months, while we struggled with a problem you could have solved in minutes. She turned to her team. "Everyone out. I need to speak with Dr. Williams alone." The engineers filed out, the MIT kid pausing to say quietly, "I'm sorry. We should have known better than to judge based on..." He trailed off, embarrassed. After they left, Victoria sat down heavily, gesturing for Marcus to do the same. "I need to understand something. Why didn't you say anything? You've seen us struggling with this for weeks. You had to have known you could help." Marcus chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, people don't generally want input from their janitor about quantum encryption. I needed this job. Saying I could help meant risking being seen as presumptuous, or delusional, or threatening. It was safer to stay silent." Victoria closed her eyes. "So we created an environment where someone with your expertise felt they couldn't speak without risking their livelihood. That's on us. That's on me." She opened her laptop, began typing quickly. Here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, you're being reassigned from janitorial services to the engineering team. Starting salary $180,000, full benefits, with a signing bonus equivalent to 6 months' pay. Additionally, if your solution works, and my engineer seems convinced it, you'll receive 10% of the contract value as a finder's. That's $80 million, Dr. Does that seem fair? Marcus couldn't. The numbers were too large, the shift too sudden. 11 months ago, he'd been sleeping in his car, unable to afford rent after his lease expired. 3 months ago, he'd finally saved enough for a security deposit on a studio apartment. Last week, he'd been calculating whether he could afford new shoes, or if his current ones had another month left. And now, Victoria Chen was offering him $80 million. Why? The question came out raw. You could have taken the solution and given me nothing. You could have fired me for overstepping. Why are you doing this? Victoria's expression was complex. Shame, admiration, pragmatism all mixed together. Because keeping you as a janitor, when you're worth millions to this company, would be the stupidest business decision I could possibly make. And because, Dr. Williams, you just saved my company from bankruptcy. That deserves recognition. The transition from janitor to senior engineer happened with a speed that left Marcus's head spinning. Within 48 hours, he had a desk on the executive floor, a company laptop, and a team of engineers who'd gone from not seeing him at all to treating him like a returning war hero. The MIT kid, whose name turned out to be David Chen, Victoria's nephew, appointed himself Marcus's unofficial handler, helping him navigate corporate politics he'd forgotten existed. People are going to underestimate you, David said over coffee in the executive cafeteria, where Marcus had served coffee just days earlier. Not because of your ability, which is obviously exceptional, but because they saw you pushing a cleaning cart. Humans are terrible at updating their initial assessments. It was true. Marcus noticed the sidelong glances, heard the whispered conversations that stopped when he approached. Some people were genuinely happy for his redemption story. Others seemed almost offended, as if his transformation violated some natural order where janitors stayed janitors and executives stayed executive. The first team meeting was awkward. Marcus sat at the conference table he'd cleaned 100 times, surrounded by engineers who'd walked past him without acknowledgement for months. Victoria led the meeting, and she didn't soft-pedal the situation. For those who haven't heard, Dr. Marcus Williams has joined our engineering team. Some of you may remember him as part of our janitorial staff. What you didn't know, what I didn't know until 3 days ago, is that Dr. Williams is one of the foremost experts in quantum computing in the country. He solved our encryption problem in 20 minutes, a problem we'd been failing to solve for 6 weeks. An older engineer named Patricia raised her hand. With respect, Victoria, how do we know his solution actually works? Has it been tested? It was a fair question, but Marcus heard the skepticism. Victoria turned to him. Dr. Williams, would you like to address that? Marcus stood, moved to the whiteboard, began explaining not just his solution but the underlying theory, the mathematical proofs, the practical applications. He spoke for 15 minutes, and by the time he finished, even Patricia was nodding. The Pentagon testing begins next week, Victoria added. If Dr. Williams's solution passes their security protocols, we secure the contract. If it doesn't, we're back where we started, which is nowhere. But I have complete confidence in his work. After the meeting, Patricia approached Marcus. I apologize. That was unfair of me. I should have judged the mathematics, not your previous position. Marcus appreciated the apology, but he understood the doubt. People needed time to adjust their worldview when reality contradicted their assumption. The solution worked. Pentagon testers spent a week trying to break Marcus's quantum encryption protocol and failed completely. TechVantage secured the $800 million contract, and overnight, the company's stock price jumped 30%. Victoria called an all-hands meeting to announce the news, and when she credited Marcus by name, the applause was genuine. He'd gone from invisible to indispensable in less than 2 weeks. But the transformation wasn't entirely smooth. Marcus discovered that having money and position didn't erase the trauma of poverty. He found himself hoarding food in his apartment. Unable to believe his circumstances had truly changed, he'd wake at 3 a.m. in a panic, convinced he'd been fired and would return to sleeping in his car. His therapist, a luxury he could finally afford, explained that financial PTSD was real, that the brain didn't easily release survival instincts even when circumstances improved. The signing bonus arrived in his account on a Tuesday morning, $90,000 after taxes. Marcus stared at the number for 10 minutes, unable to process it. He'd spent 7 years calculating whether he could afford a $3 sandwich. Now he had more money than he'd earned in some entire years of his previous life. His first purchase was practical, paying off the medical debt that still haunted him despite his wife being gone 3 years. His second was emotional, a donation to the hospital that had cared for her, earmarked specifically for patients who couldn't afford treatment. The $80 million finder's fee would come when the Pentagon made first payment. Victoria had established it in writing, legally binding, impossible to take back even if she changed her mind. I don't renege on deals, she told him. You saved this company. You deserve to benefit from that. Marcus was still processing the reality that he'd be a wealthy man, that financial security wasn't just possible but inevitable, that he'd never again have to choose between medicine and rent. But wealth created its own complication. His former colleagues from the janitorial staff treated him differently, some with pride in his success, others with resentment or distance that hurt more than he'd expected. Maria, who'd shared her lunch with him, he couldn't afford to buy his own, now seemed uncomfortable around him. You're management now, she said when he invited her to coffee. It's not the same. Marcus understood. He'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, moved from one world to another, and bridges were burning behind him whether he wanted them to or not. David became an unexpected friend, possibly because he'd never known Marcus as just the janitor. You're going to be famous, David said one afternoon, showing Marcus articles already appearing in tech publications. Janitor to millionaire, the quantum computing genius hiding in plain sight. Marcus hated the headlines, hated becoming a story rather than a person. I just want to work, he told Victoria when she asked about media requests. I don't want to be inspiration porn for people who want to feel good about the American dream. Victoria respected that mostly, but she did insist he attend the Pentagon contract signing ceremony. This is your victory too. You should be there when we make it official. So Marcus found himself in Washington, D.C., wearing a suit that actually fit, standing beside Victoria as they signed documents that would define TechVantage's future for years to come. A Pentagon official shook his hand. Dr. Williams, your work is going to protect American communications for the next decade. That's no small thing. Marcus nodded, accepting the praise while remembering he'd been living in his car less than a year ago. 6 months after his transformation from janitor to senior engineer, Marcus sat in Victoria's office discussing something that had been bothering him since the beginning. We need to talk about Marie. Victoria looked up from her laptop. Your friend from janitorial services? What about her? Marcus leaned forward. She's brilliant. She speaks 4 languages fluently, has an MBA from a university in Mexico that her country doesn't recognize here, and she's been cleaning toilets for 3 years because her visa status makes it impossible to get hired in her field. Victoria was quiet for a moment. And you think we should do something about that? Marcus met her eyes. I think we should stop wasting talent because we're too lazy to look past job titles. Maria is one of 25 people on our janitorial staff. How many of them have skills we're not using because we've decided janitors are just janitors? How much capability are we throwing away because we judge people by their circumstances instead of their potential? It was a challenge, and they both knew it. Victoria could dismiss it, could say that hiring practices weren't Marcus's concern, that he should focus on his engineering work and let HR handle staffing. Instead, she surprised him. What do you propose? Marcus pulled out a document he'd been preparing for weeks. An internal talent assessment program. We interview every employee regardless of position, document their skills and education, identify people who are underutilized. Then we create pathways for them to transition into roles that actually match their capability. Victoria read through his proposal, her expression unreadable. This would be expensive. Training programs, transition support, salary increases for people moving into different roles. We're talking millions of dollars. Marcus nodded. The encryption solution I provided is worth $800 million to this company. I'm asking for $3 million to find out how much other talent we're. That's less than 0.5% of the contract value. Seems like a reasonable investment in not being stupid. Victoria laughed. Actually, not being stupid. I like that as a business philosophy. She signed the proposal. Fine. You have your $3 million, but you're going to run this program personally. If it succeeds, it's your success. If it fails, it's your failure. Fair. Marcus extended his hand. Fair. They shook on it, and Marcus felt something shift. He wasn't just an engineer who'd gotten lucky. He was becoming someone who could change systems, who could use his position to help others still trapped where he'd been. The Talent Discovery Program, as they officially named, began with the janitorial staff. Marcus personally interviewed every cleaner, maintenance worker, and groundskeeper. The stories were heartbreaking and infuriating in equal measure. A former doctor from Syria working night shifts because his medical credentials weren't recognized. A woman with a degree in electrical engineering cleaning offices because a conviction for a crime she insisted she didn't commit made her unemployable elsewhere. A man who'd taught mathematics in Ghana before immigrating, now emptying trash cans because he lacked American teaching certification. Maria was his first success story. Her MBA and language skills made her perfect for TechVantage's international business development team. Victoria created a position specifically for Latin American market with a salary 4 times what she'd been making as a janitor. When Marcus told her, Maria cried. "I thought I would clean toilets forever," she said. "I thought this was all I would ever be in America." Marcus understood that feeling intimately. Over the next year, the program expanded beyond janitorial services to every entry-level position in the company. They discovered a receptionist with a PhD in materials science who'd been answering phones for minimum wage, a mailroom worker who'd built 3 successful apps in his spare time, a cafeteria cook who'd been a mechanical engineer before a recession destroyed his industry. 23 people total were identified as dramatically underutilized. 15 were successfully transitioned into positions matching their capability. The program's success attracted media attention Victoria couldn't suppress. Forbes wrote a feature, TechVantage's Radical Approach to Talent, Looking Past Job Titles. Harvard Business Review published a case study. Other companies started reaching out, asking how to implement similar programs. Marcus became an unwilling spokesperson for the idea that capability existed everywhere if you bothered to look for it. But not everyone appreciated the program. Some managers resented having to consider janitors and mailroom workers for professional positions. Some employees who'd climbed traditional career ladders felt it was unfair that others got to skip steps. There were complaints to HR, accusations of discrimination, claims that standards were being lowered. Victoria backed Marcus completely. "Standards aren't being lowered," she told a particularly vocal middle manager. "We're just stopping the practice of overlooking qualified people because we decided their circumstances defined their worth." The $80 million finder's fee arrived in Marcus's account 14 months after he'd solved the encryption problem. He stared at the number, actually $73 million after taxes, but still incomprehensible. Wealth, and felt nothing at first. Then everything at once. Relief, disbelief, survivor's guilt thinking about people still struggling the way he had been. He'd promised himself that if this money actually materialized, he'd do something meaningful. He established the Second Chance Education Fund with $20 million. The fund provided full scholarships for people over 35 who'd had to abandon education due to economic circumstances, with priority given to those who'd experienced homelessness, medical bankruptcy, or family caregiving responsibilities that disrupted their careers. The remaining $53 million he invested conservatively, keeping enough to live comfortably while using the returns to fund additional programs helping people transition from poverty to stability. "You could have kept it all," David said when Marcus explained his plans. "Nobody would have judged you." Marcus shook his head. "I would have judged me. I had luck. Victoria happened to be in that conference room when I couldn't stay silent. Most people in my situation don't get that luck. If I can create more opportunities for others, that matters more than having a bigger house." 2 years after the night he'd stopped being invisible, Marcus stood on a stage at TechVantage's annual conference. Preparing to give a keynote address Victoria had insisted he deliver. The audience of 3,000 included employees, investors, clients, and media. Far more attention than he wanted. Less than he could avoid given his position. He looked out at the crowd and saw Maria in the 3rd row, now senior analyst with her own team. He saw the former Syrian doctor, now leading TechVantage's medical technology division. He saw faces of people the talent discovery program had helped transition from invisibility to recognition. 3 years ago, Marcus began. "I was sleeping in my car." The room went silent. People knew his story in general terms, but he'd never spoken publicly about the detail. "I had a PhD from Stanford. I'd published papers that are still cited in quantum computing research, but I also had medical debt I couldn't pay, grief I couldn't process, and a 7-year gap in my resume that made me unhireable in my field. So I became a janitor, because janitors get hired every day without anyone asking why they're not something else." He paused, letting that sink in. "For 11 months I cleaned the offices where people struggled with problems I could solve. I emptied trash cans containing papers covered with equations I was invisible. Not because I wanted to, but because that's what happens when your circumstances don't match your capabilities. People stop seeing you as a person they see you as the role you're filling, and they assume that role defines every." Marcus told the story of that night in the conference room, of speaking when silence was safer, of Victoria's decision to look past his janitor's uniform and see his actual. "But here's what I learned that's more important." Jewel story, he said. "For every person like who gets noticed, there are hundreds who don't. Thousands. People with capabilities we desperately, who remain invisible because we've decided their current circumstances predict their future potential. We're wasting human talent on a massive scale. We call it meritocracy." He brought up data on the screen behind him. The talent discovery program has assessed 847 employees across all levels of this company. We've found 203 people significantly underutilized based on their education, skills, and experience. That's 24% of our workforce. Nearly 1 in 4 people working here are capable of contributing far more than their current roles allow, And TechVantage is probably better than most companies at identifying talent, which means this problem is everywhere. The implications were staggering, and he saw people in the audience beginning to understand. We're not just wasting individual potential, we're crippling our entire economy by letting bias about circumstances override assessment of capability. We're losing innovations that could change the world because the person who could develop them is cleaning toilets instead of running labs. We're making ourselves weaker, poorer, and less competitive because we're too intellectually lazy to look past job titles. Marcus had never been this blunt publicly before, but Victoria had given him explicit permission to speak freely. So here's my challenge to every company represented here today. Stop assuming that people's current positions reflect their maximum capability. Stop conflating circumstances with intelligence. Stop wasting the talent you already have because you're too blind to see it. He paused. Or don't, and watch your competitors start doing it instead, and then wonder why you're losing ground. The applause was uncertain at first, then building. Some people were clearly uncomfortable. Change always made people uncomfortable, but others were nodding, considering, maybe seeing their own organizations differently. After Marcus left the stage, a line formed of people wanting to talk with him. CEOs asking about implementing similar programs, employees sharing their own stories of being overlooked, a young woman in her 20s who told him tearfully that she was currently working retail despite having a degree in biochemistry, that his story gave her hope she wouldn't be stuck for. That evening, Victoria hosted a small private dinner for Marcus, David, Maria, and several others whose lives the program had changed. I want to acknowledge something, Victoria said. When Marcus first approached me about this program, my initial instinct was to say no. It seemed expensive, risky, potentially disruptive. I said yes because I owed him, not because I believed it. She looked around the table. I was wrong. This might be the most important thing TechVantage has done in my tenure as CEO. Not because it's good PR, though it is, because it's made us better at what we do. We're smarter, more innovative, and more profitable because we stopped wasting the capability we already had. Marcus appreciated the acknowledgement, but he knew the real test wasn't internal success. It was whether other companies would follow. Over the next year, 17 major corporations implemented their own versions of talent discovery programs. Some did it well, genuinely assessing their workforces and creating opportunities. Others did it performatively, checking a diversity box without making real changes. But even imperfect implementation was better than none. And Marcus saw evidence that attitudes were slowly shifting. The most unexpected outcome was personal. Marcus received a call from his former employer, the tech firm where he'd worked before his wife's illness. They wanted him back, offering a position as Chief Innovation Officer with a salary that made his current compensation look modest. We made a mistake letting you go, the CEO said. We'd like to correct that. Marcus listened politely, then declined. I'm where I need to be. But thank you for acknowledging that circumstances aren't permanent. His life had transformed so completely that sometimes Marcus struggled to believe it was real. He owned a house now, not extravagant, but comfortable, in a neighborhood where he could walk safely at night. He'd reconnected with his daughter, who he'd barely spoken to during the worst years because his shame made communication unbearable. She was proud of him, showed her friends articles about his work, told him he was her hero. That meant more than any amount of money. But Marcus never forgot what invisibility felt like. He donated generously to homeless services, medical debt relief funds, programs supporting people rebuilding after life catastrophes. He mentored people trying to re-enter their fields after long absences. And he continued pushing Victoria and the board to expand talent discovery beyond TechVantage, to create industry standards for assessing capability rather than credentials. You're never satisfied, are you? Victoria asked him one. Marcus smiled. I was invisible for 7 years. I know exactly how many people are still invisible. Until that changes, no, I'm not satisfied. 5 years after Marcus had spoken up in that conference room, TechVantage's talent discovery program had become an industry standard adopted by over 200 companies. Marcus had left TechVantage to run the non-profit he'd founded, Rediscovered Talent Initiative, which helped organizations implement similar programs and supported individuals trying to rebuild careers after disruption. Victoria remained one of his biggest supporters, serving on his board and providing funding. The non-profit's success metrics were remarkable. Of the 14,000 people they'd helped assess and transition over 5 years, 82% were successfully working in positions matching their capabilities rather than their circumstances. The economic impact was measurable. These individuals collectively earned $340 million more annually than they had in their previous role, paying more taxes, contributing more to their communities, raising children with better opportunity. But Marcus measured success differently. He measured it in the woman who went from cleaning hotel rooms to managing the hotel's operations. The man who went from warehouse work to software development. The single mother who went from retail cashier to financial analyst. Each story represented someone who'd been invisible becoming visible, someone who'd been dismissed becoming valued. Marcus was invited to speak at Stanford, his alma mater. Standing in the same auditorium where he'd defended his dissertation 20 years earlier, he faced students who represented the privileged path he'd once walked. Your education is valuable, he told them, but it doesn't make you valuable. Your intelligence is important, but it doesn't make you special. What makes you special is what you do with advantages you've been given, whether you use them to reinforce hierarchies that keep talented people invisible, or whether you use them to create systems that reveal capability wherever it exists. He told them about Maria, about the Syrian doctor, about the 100 other people whose talents had been wasted because systems preferred credentials over capability. Some of you will build companies, he said. Some will lead existing organizations. Some will make policy. When you do, I want you to remember that the next breakthrough, the next innovation, the next solution to an impossible problem might come from someone you'd never think to ask. The janitor, the receptionist, the person you've trained yourself not to see. Your choice is whether you'll create environments where those people stay invisible, or whether you'll look for talent in unexpected places. After the speech, a student approached him nervously. Dr. Williams, I have a question. What if we try to implement these programs and they fail? What if the people we promote aren't actually as capable as they seemed? Marcus appreciated the honesty. Then you made a bad hire, which happens in every hiring process regardless of where candidates come from. The difference is that when you hire someone with a perfect resume and they fail, you blame the individual. But when you hire someone from an unconventional background and they fail, you blame the entire concept of looking beyond traditional credentials. That double standard is the problem. Marcus's personal life had found stability he'd never expected. He'd started dating again, a professor at Berkeley who specialized in organizational psychology, and found his work fascinating. His daughter had graduated college and was working at a non-profit doing similar work to his, helping formerly incarcerated people transition back into society. You inspired me, she told him. You showed me that people deserve second chances, third chances, as many chances as they need to become who they're capable of being. The financial security still felt surreal sometimes. Marcus drove a modest car, lived in a comfortable but not extravagant house, and gave away most of his wealth to causes he cared about. But knowing he'd never again face the terror of homelessness, never again have to choose between medicine and food, never again be invisible because circumstances made him dismissible, that was worth more than any amount of money. Victoria invited him to lunch one afternoon, and over coffee she said something that surprised him. I've been thinking about what you told me 5 years ago, about creating an environment where you felt you couldn't speak. I've worked hard to change that, but I wonder if I've really succeeded, or if I've just made it easier for the people I've already noticed while others remain invisible. It was a perceptive question. Marcus considered it carefully. You've made real changes. The program exists. People have been helped. But you're right that there's always a next level. The ultimate goal isn't making it easier for janitors to become engineers. It's eliminating the assumption that someone's job title defines their intelligence, capability, or worth. They talked for 2 hours about what that would require. Fundamentally, rethinking how organizations assessed value, how societies measured success, how individuals determined whose voices deserved to be heard. It was ambitious, maybe impossible, but Marcus had learned that impossible just meant nobody had figured it out yet. 5 years ago, people had said his encryption solution was impossible. 2 years ago, they'd said creating a successful talent discovery model was impossible. He'd been told his entire life that certain things were impossible, and he'd made a career of proving otherwise. As Marcus left the restaurant, he passed a young black woman struggling with an overloaded cleaning cart, trying to maneuver it through the door. He held the door open, and she thanked him without making eye contact. The automatic deference of someone used to being invisible. Marcus wanted to tell her that he'd been exactly where she was, that circumstances weren't permanent, that capability didn't disappear just because nobody was looking, but he didn't. Because that's not what invisible people need to hear from strangers. Instead, he made a note of which companies she worked for, which building she was cleaning. Tomorrow, he'd contact them about implementing a talent discovery assessment. Because that was the real work. Not inspiring individuals with stories of redemption, but changing systems that made redemption necessary in the first place. If this story resonated with, share it with someone who needs to hear that intelligence doesn't require credentials, that capability doesn't disappear during hard times, and that the most expensive assumption any organization can make is that people's current circumstances reflect their maximum potential. We all have choices about who we see and who we dismiss. Marcus Williams spent 7 years being dismissed, then 20 minutes proving he'd always been worth seeing. How many people in your life are you overlooking because they don't match your mental image of the next breakthrough, the next innovation, the next solution might come from the person you've trained yourself not to notice. Choose to see them. That's how we stop wasting human potential and start building a world where talent is recognized, regardless of where it appears.